and it is a pleasure and a privilege to welcome all of you to the second webinar in the Ruta and regions and Latin America in conversations. These webinars are a joint initiative. And this initiative aims to bring regions that are oftentimes contrasted or even pitted against each other into conversation to find shared commonalities and solidarities. The Root Association is an association that was established after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine as a response, an academic, activist, artist response that aimed to create a platform where scholars and other practitioners can create knowledge that allows for Ruta regions, Europe's East, Central Europe, the Balkans, North Asia, to be known and to know each other and themselves on their own terms. And very much in this spirit, these webinars also happen. Today's webinar is going to be recorded so that we can come back to this material at a later time as well. There are a number of people that could not be here today because of conflicting schedules. But because the webinars are recorded, we get quite a bit of feedback that people find this material at a later time, and it continues to serve as educational, as informational material much, much later. Also, if you find what Ruta does to be important, if you gain value from our initiatives, we would invite you to become our member. And it is some of the best value for very little money that you can find. And you will be then on top of all the information about upcoming events, on our publications and everything else. We would also invite you to support us if you can financially, and if not, to spread the word about these webinars and our mission on your social media, your academic, artist, and activist circles, and in other ways. Today's webinar on resistance to authoritarianism is moderated by one of Ruta and Latin American Dialogue's initiator, Manuel Perez Gil. And so I will hand over the symbolic microphone to him.
Thank you, Gracina. Thank you, Acel, Armando, Ignacy, all the Ruta crew, Anna. For us in Latin America, I will talk for Armando a little bit. It's a great opportunity to know what are people doing, scholars doing in Kazakhstan, in Poland, in other places. Is very important because before we can talk about solidarity, we need to know each other. We need to know what we are doing in Cuba, in Mexico, in Chile, in Kazakhstan, etc. So thank you for that. So our first speaker is Acel Tutumlu. She is a faculty member at Near East University, specializing in Central Asian, particularly Kazakh resistance and grassroots movement. Thank you, Acel. It's very important for us to know what is happening in Kazakhstan, because in Latin America, we don't know anything about Kazakhstan. If we don't know anything about Ukraine, and it's very important to know the grassroots movement and the resistance in Kazakhstan. So, Acel, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I have to also say two things, that the kind of the knowledge gaps are mutual. I think we have very, very little information about Latin America. I've just recently attended the series of webinars at the New School for Social Research on actually the voices of resistance in Latin America. It was really, really illuminating for me, obviously, to see the differences, to see a much more, let's say, freer society than we have in Central Asian states. And the second thing is this is the beginning of research. I mean, it's not necessarily, I haven't published much on that, but I am working on kind of figuring out the the workings of authoritarianisms in everyday and the importance of spaces, spaces of resistance. And so what I wanted to do today is to kind of go through what the literature tells us, and then ask two important questions about how that all of that applies to Central Asia and to the possibilities of resistance. And I think in that sense, I'm very privileged, I think, to be together in this panel to discuss the possibilities of what does it mean to be free in the space where politics is so depoliticized, yeah, where the public field is so dominated by the regime and the official dogmas that it becomes so difficult to actually really challenge this specific knowledge that has been imposed and controlled by the political regimes. And obviously Hannah Arendt talked about it quite a while ago, but the importance of her idea in Central Asia comes to the fact that if the public field is so depoliticized in the sense that you cannot question what the regime tells you, then politics goes underground. Yeah, and politics goes into these private political spaces, just like in solidarity movements in Eastern Europe. We do have a kind of conspiratorial networks that are trying to basically create space, really create a little bit of space for discussion, space for thinking, for acting as free people. And in this sense, the resistance in the resistance groups in Central Asia initially obviously operate more like a conspiracy, like conspiratorial networks. They begin as secret societies, they talk in private kitchens, conversations, they share different ideas through really kind of like semi-legal means. They have closed chats. They discuss, for example, how to potentially create and mobilize people, or what would be the opportunities for people to do this. And then obviously, these specific conversations remain beneath the radar of the state up until there is either a window of opportunity that opens, or there is, for example, a kind of a critical mass of people that has been generated. A friend of mine, Diana Kudai-Bergen, just actually wrote a book, and we are, together with other Ruta member, Teresa Hendel, are working on the book symposium about it. And that's exactly about these types of movements that have been generating this idea of how to create the free society and how do we start. And in Diana's story, I think the importance of spaces, the importance of discussions, the importance of social media and different street performances, where in creative way, groups begin to really ridicule the regime, ridicule the banality of violence, so to say. And through humor, then they're able to transform societies, not necessarily from the perspective of changing the regime, but actually just emancipating the individual from this political control. And resistance in many ways in Central Asia is about that emancipation. I think that's where we are. And in my very superficial judgment from Latin America, I think in Latin America, it's so much more profound. It's so much more about the possibilities of actually doing something beyond just the feeling free, yeah, and acting free, yeah. In Kazakhstan, at least, it's a very restricted and very kind of careful game that our opposition needs to play. And another thing that we can then study from the literature is that, well, let's say if there is indeed a kind of a critical mass of people that are there and want to live a kind of a free life, then what is missing in Central Asian, in Kazakhstani at least, resistance is this a kind of a common institutionalized position and the lack of common vision of how exactly we are going to build the future. What the Eastern European example, and I think Ignacy can talk more about it, tells us is that, and this is again from the book Politics of Small Things, written by Jeffrey Goldfarb, from the New School for Social Research, who in his 80s, in his fieldwork, noted that actually, if we compare Romania, Czech Republic, and Poland, we can see that violent transition that took place in Romania appeared because the opposition was never able to really solidify itself, and different voices of opposition were never actually able to solidify into one common vision and to one institutionalized fraction, so to say. In Poland, institutionalization happened, but then it included too many different, again, disparate organizations under it. Whereas in Czech Republic and in Poland, there was a much stronger, a much more unified vision of how the future should be organized. And looking at this type of very inspirational events in the past, it brought me to kind of two key questions, basically. The first question is, in a kind of a digital age and surveillance that we are living in the era of Palantirs, in the era of Googles and so on, can we actually have this political, uncompromised, let's say, private political spaces? And can these spaces be effective in really changing the way we, really challenging the locus of power? Because if we think about where the common locus of power is today, it's no longer in, for example, vested in the elites or the states. It's vested in the concentration of wealth rather than economic growth. The system is characterized by environmental catastrophe instead of efficient use of resources. The system is characterized by technological dependencies instead of freedoms. And the question is then, what is possible? And we definitely see in Central Asia, we have seen the violent resistance that took place in January 2022. It was a very bloody event with the regime trying to instill fear into majority of population by basically allowing open fire on the civilians, and also conducting torture. But then there is also a non-violent solution, right? And the non-violent solution requires us to really think of how to address the power of the purse and the power of the force, yeah? And I think in that sense, I'm very curious about how exactly, what are the methodologies and strategies that the Latin American communities have been using, and what are the challenges that they experience. And the second question then that leads me to the, from here, is what should be the definition of people that is united enough in solidarity and builds solidarity without actually changing and challenging or fracturing the society. I mean, in the age of polarization in Central Asia, we now see attempts to establish communities that are very exclusive, very right-wing. They are conservative and illiberal. And if we take a look at how, for example, the nation is conceived in the Kazakh-speaking digital space, so to say, and also how regime is conceiving it, it's very much about a kind of a cultural, an ethno-cultural phenomenon that is linked to the sacredness of land. And so the people who live and habitate this land have the sovereign right to determine how exactly the future of this land is going to take place. And then, therefore, the land is kind of rooted in the lifestyle, traditions, principles of social political organization of very specific ethnic group. So that's, again, and this ethnic group has very specific primordial understanding of what the nation is. So, and we can see similar type of imaginations, yeah, of building solidarities, national solidarities around in other Central Asian states. And so what we see, I think, is a very big asymmetry where we see the concentration of power and wealth in the transnational elites, but we're still, I think, our language of resistance still remains very much ethnic, national, very fractured. And unfortunately, the left is not really offering too much inspiration for an alternative position or an alternative solution for a global type of building global solidarities. Yeah, and so that's basically where I would stop. So we are in Central Asia, I think, at the very kind of beginning, in a way, trying to taste the emancipation rather than be able to have the capacity and ability to change the regimes and the systems and have a common vision about where exactly we would like to go in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Acel. I really like your presentation, especially when you quote the politics of small gold far, a very important book for all, not only in Central Asia, but also in Latin America, as we will see with our second speaker. Our second speaker is
me.
Armando Chaguaceda.
Yes,
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, yes. I lost
Armando
your voice
Chaguaceda is a political
sometimes,
scientist of Amherst College and researcher and political analysis, Gapac, Mexico. Sorry, go Armando, because I have internet issues.
Yes, yes, it's your internet. Okay, I was thinking that was mine. Well, thank you, Ruta team, family, to invite me here to talk just a little. Thank you, Asel, because you were talking about Latin America is so far in epistemic and political reality of Central Asia, but in my case, I'm going to talk about Cuba, and Cuba is not so far because Cuba is, Cuba is the prolongation of a Soviet model. So we share a lot of things in our past 7 decades. So I'm going to talk about these issues in my presentation. I brought a text, I brought a small text, and I pretend to share with you to promote the conversation. So I'm going to read to be more clear in my ideas the text. The title of my presentation is Beyond the Western Crisis, the Long Memories of Resistance and the Academic Capture by Cuban Authoritarianism. So, good morning to everyone. I want to start with a confession about the way that our field usually talk about authoritarianism. When scholars in USA or Western Europe talk about the crisis of democracy, they almost always mean something special that happened in the last decade with their own institution and their own surprises. Trump, Brexit, the rise of right and left wing populists, the erosion of norms inside long established democracy, and other phenomena. But the surprise is that with this process, with this situation, have been increased a whole vocabulary that emerged about democratic backsliding, illiberalism, polarization, that the European, that the global north scholars have built to try to explain the crisis that they suffer, that they feel, and that they like to transform. But we have a problem from the point of view and from the point of the world that I'm looking this crisis. The problem is that for millions of people, in my case, but my parents and the grandparents, have spent our entire life under authoritarian rules. So the authoritarian rule is not a challenge, it's a reality. It's a very long established reality. So we have learned to build our entire intellectual and civic experience and resistance living inside, as happened in Kazakhstan, another regime of Central Asia, inside a very long-standing authoritarianism that exists mainly beyond the border of Western. And the other characteristic that is for me very important is how to explain that the most sophisticated, the most patient, the most globally networked authoritarian regime projects in the last, 7, 8, 9 decades were never confined to their home borders, They were connect an important network of cooperation between dictatorship, but at the same time, they were very, very more danger than the rising challenge of illiberal populism. So I'm going to talk right now about anti-liberal phenomenon that is qualitatively most complex to defeat, to resist, maybe to understand that the most recent illiberal, because illiberal regime, practice, and actor exists in the border of democracy. You know, the populist regime is Orban regime, is Trump regime, but we are going to talk about anti-liberal regime that have the origin in the totalitarian model, especially in the Soviet model. So we are going to talk about this situation. And let me talk just a little about the results of our experience of resistance, advocacy, and in research about this phenomenon in Latin America. And Cuban regime is the first idea. It's not a recent authoritarian experiment. It's a very long-standing, longest-running single-party system in the modern world. We have 7 decades with this regime. It's the most authoritarian regime in Western Hemisphere, but it's the only experience of totalitarian regime in the Western Hemisphere. It's a different animal. It's not the traditional oligarch military regime of the Western Hemisphere. But right wing is a left authoritarian with totalitarian model regime. So we haven't experienced democratic backsliding because we haven't experienced before democratic transition. We are living under a system in which right now have been increased the protest, the citizen protest. In Cuba itself, for example, we are experiencing a very important increasing of the popular protest right now due to a group of situation. But at the same time, the civil society, the civic fabric of the knowledge have been destroyed by the persistent intervention of the state. So we have in Cuba a lot of people on rallies protesting all the days, but the civil society organized have been destroyed systematically by the government. At the same time, we have, as you talk, especially talking about Poland and other cases, we have a source of hiding independent academic and intellectual sphere. And not only as in the 80s year was in the informal network of confidence in the kitchen, but also in the virtual world of internet and some small spaces. So at the same time, we have a totalitarian style system in Cuba. We have a population that is changing the political culture, have been more vocal, more brave in the street, and we are challenging the state from spaces of intellectual autonomy, spaces of civic organization, not recognized, repressed by the state, but we are in this general situation. But at the same time, this Cuban state has developed a very important capacity to give influence, to transport their objectives, their goals to Latin America. But how? Well, create their own networks inside the Latin America, and for me it's very sad. At the same time, it's very interesting to study, to understand, inside the Latin American Academy. For example, they have created, and we prepare a book in GAPAC, is free access, you can access and download. We developed a research recently that we call Authoritarian Gravity Center, Scaling Authoritarian Influence, about the cooperation between Russia and Cuba. And as we can see, Cuba have a big influence inside the organized network of intellectual and social science academy in Latin America. Council of Latin American Social Science, Manuel Ferres, no, Claxo, for example. The biggest network of social science, organized social science in Latin America that was created by scholars and intellectuals to support their colleagues that were challenged by and under danger by the right-wing dictatorship in the past, right now is a big whole structure that has been used by the Cuban system to spread propaganda. What kind of propaganda? A kind of propaganda that is very well received in due to foundational characteristic of the academic life, is very well received by the academic sphere and community. First, it's a limited source of anti-imperialism, because it's not against the Russian imperialism, it's always against American imperialism. Second one, a rejection of liberal democracy, but not to think about another post-liberal democracy, but to support other alternatives between Marx, like the Chinese model, the Russian model, the Cuban model, that are in the global south, they suppose that are in the global south, challenge to the imperialists of the north. At the same time, the idea that inside the academy, we don't need to defend, as I suppose that we need to defend, a trans-ideological consensus about the main ideas of democracy, trans-ideological consensus between democratic right forces and democratic left forces. No, they support the idea that the democratic space, democracy itself, it's only from the left and from one interpretation of the left that they allow that is the correct, the illiberal or anti-liberal left. So in our work, we have been developed the explanation of how the actor, the network, the message have been connected. And for us, it's very important because this space of Ruta to share our idea with you, because especially with the scholars that have been born and developed their life and their career in the post-Soviet space, I think that is probably one of the only space that have the capacity to understand us. In other place, we are very strange creature. We talk about this, for example, in Global North Conference. And I am not only historian, but I am political theorist, for example. And I have discussion with my dear colleagues of the Global North, because they talk about, the most dangerous challenge is illiberalism. And I thought, no, there is a history about anti-liberalism that is worse than illiberalism. No, the worst is illiberalism. And the worst is the right-wing illiberalism. And I thought, no, the right-wing illiberalism is very dangerous, but we have an experience with left extreme with. So it's another war. And in Latin America, that is an hybrid. Latin America is a part of the West world, but it's the part of the global South. It's a mutual reaction. For one sense, and for one side, the liberals, the democratic scholar, share with us our rejection to the right wing attacks to the Freedom Academy, but they don't share as a real challenge the attacks of the challenge that we suffer from left wing dictatorship. And the other part of the academy is absolutely a complete militant academy. So they are not only concede us, as happened with the liberal colleagues, that something happened in Cuba, in Venezuela. No. They defend that Cuba and Venezuela are models of how the thing should be. So in Latin America, but also in the West, in Europe, in North America, is a problem for us. That's the reason for example, the struggle about and the solidarity with Ukraine for us is very important, because it's a mixture of the struggle by independence, but the popular sovereignty, but national sovereignty at the same time. It's a struggle with anti-imperialism, and it's a struggle for the defense of a model of democracy that is not perfect, but combine open society, political pluralism, and academic autonomy. So all the work that we are producing, sharing, trying to use in incidents, in advocacy, in GAPAC, in our NGO, is in these 10 years, is direct by this idea. So let me finish with few ideas about what does global articulation of us actually should require. So the first, understand that the sequence matters. So at the same time that the authoritarian global alliance between regime have been developed in the times, we need to understand that the sequence of our preparation to resist is important. We need to put more attention, I think, that the attention that has been put in recent years, not to the illiberal populist government inside democracy with troubles, with problems, but also we need to put more attention to the cooperation that has been increased against the academy and against the the civil society in the anti-liberal regimes, because are more qualitative, more danger, and more coherent in their challenge to the democracy and the academic freedom. The second one, we need to develop more institutional scrutiny and self-scrutiny to know where we are. Because, for example, in Latin America, we can see if we arrive, if you arrive to Latin America, that the main organized network of social science, not the people that have that participate. The people that participate are diverse, but the direction by 25 years has been in different hands, but these hands all together are the coincidence to defend the authoritarian left as a challenge, as alternative to the imperialist, that is USA, and to the alternative to the right-wing populism. So we need to understand the institutional network where we are operating. So we need to sustain, and it's for me very difficult to explain to the other colleagues, a symmetry of scrutiny and a symmetry of comprehension. We need to develop a clear and more global comprehension of the challenge to the academic freedom with a trans-ideological position. For me, it doesn't matter if a government is right-wing, but it's authoritarian right-wing. For me, even in my case that I have been suffered, that I have been affected by the left, right, authoritarian government, but at the same time, I think that it's a danger, it's a challenge. For who? For the people, for my colleagues that live under this system, this country. At the same time, I try to explain to my colleagues the other position. I have a history very short. It was funny at the end. I was invited to Hungary to talk in a conference, I think that 2 years ago, and 3 days before the conference was canceled my participation because the Orban government, and Orban, you remember, was in the young age anti-communist, were to receive the Cuban foreign minister. So the Orban government, that is one of the, or was one of the most brilliant example of right-wing illiberalism, was very interested to develop relation, he have relation with China, for example, and Russia, with the Cuban communist regime. So it's an example of how we, as scholars and activists, can be affected by unimaginable cooperation between authoritarian forces that they understand very clear that they are against the people who defend autonomy, liberty, and autonomy in the academy, civil society, independence, and political pluralism. We need the other point, we need to develop an infrastructure of resistance, not only in ideas, not only in casual moment, conversation that are very important, as this conversation is important, but we need to develop conscious, very organized infrastructure of resisting. We need to organize our spaces of conversation, our collaborative research, our action and agenda of incidents advocacy in the international sphere. And at the same time, we need to don't abandon the traditional space, even if these spaces are under the influence of the money, the power, and the propaganda of the authoritarian regime. We need to conceive, we need to understand that we are in the global struggle for the academic freedom with different speeds, with different realities, but with common challenges that have different fates. Well, for me, it's very important to be here. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you to everyone. And the most important is the thing that we are going to do in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Armando. I'm sorry for my internet issues. We will add at the recording the link to GAPAC, is the organization of Armando. You will find a lot of publication in Spanish, but you can translate in your computer. And yes, Armando, that's our goal, to create a network, a permanent and constant network in Ruta with Latin American, to learn each other, to work together, and make a real solidarity between us. Thank you, Armando. Our last speaker is Ignacy Józwiak. I say the last, I was practice Ignacy. So Ignacy is a researcher at the Center of Migration Research, University of Warsaw, active in labor organizing and civil society. Thank you very much, Ignacy. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Asel and Armando, for setting up the discussion. And Manuel, your pronunciation of my surname was almost perfect. So, and it's not, and it is not easy. So after Asel spoke a lot, not only about Kazakhstan, but about Central Asia in general. Armando spoke about Latin America. Now I feel kind of obliged to speak not only about Poland, but about Central and Eastern Europe in general. I will try to make some references, even though I don't feel fully entitled to that. With our neighboring countries and nations, we do not share language like in the case of Latin America, and neither we share common statehood like Kazakhstan does with most of its neighbors. But the idea of Ruta, as I understand it, and I've been observing and participating in different initiatives from the very beginning, was to create platform between scholars and activists, intellectuals from different, to use as neutral word as possible, underprivileged regions of the world, let's say. Of course, now, like, we could open the whole Pandora box, who is privileged against whom, and what does it mean. But I remember at the first Ruta conference 2 years ago, there was a huge debate how to avoid labels of like post-Soviet, Central Eastern European, and what to replace it with. And it wasn't quite conclusive, which is why I still use the notions of Central and Eastern Europe. And I kind of identify with that as well. When about 2 years ago, I was explaining the basic history of Poland to a person from Mexico who was here. So like in the car traveling through Poland, I was like giving a very short and simplified lecture about Polish history and the general phenomenon of Poland, mentioning this, let's say, more interesting and brightest points in our history, like referring to not only like legacy of kingdom, empire, peasant serfdom, and the conquest of what is now Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, but also about resistance, about peasants' resistance to serfdom, about different initiatives undermining this universal authority. Then, like, I was explaining the specifics of Polish struggles for independence in 19th century, and such episodes like participation of some Polish soldiers in Haitian Revolution. Yeah? I mean, this might not be a common knowledge outside Poland, but when Haiti rebelled against the French, the French sent the army, including Polish troops in French service. Some of them refused to fight against Haitians, identifying the common cause with them, and some of them joined the uprising. Some of them were even considered as kind of honorary Haitians or even honorary black. A short digression, but I think significant for the idea of Ruta. That was the very beginning of 19th century, where the idea of race was still developing, and the idea of race and racial distinction didn't serve as a base, as a principle in political thinking. So some scholars point to the fact that, okay, like back then, it was kind of obvious for the Polish people fighting against colonialists and occupiers from Russia, Austria, and Prussia, that they easily identified with the cause of Haitian slaves because the color of skin at that time was still not decisive. This could be like, a kind of historical anecdote, which also fits the mission of Ruta, and collecting and connecting not only studies and thoughts, but also histories or solidarities. And one more anecdote after this very short introduction to Polish history. I thought to myself, well, actually, I never thought of that, but Poland does have a interesting history, and which can be related to other regions of the world and some emancipatory projects. So let me start with this kind of positive remarks. Another kind of founding context of Ruta has been Russia's war against Ukraine. I'm a scholar of migration, but in my research I focus on Ukrainian perspective on migration relocations, which also makes my research and my involvement closer to Ukrainian issues. So I will also try to give some hints about and possible inspirations from Ukraine. So, Azel and Armando talked a lot about authoritarianism, authoritarian governments, and not going into details and definitions. In Poland, we did have certain authoritarian turn during peace, law and justice, conservative / kind of far-right leaning government between 2015 and 2024, but the situation in Poland was quite far from what you might experience in Kazakhstan, not to mention Cuba, or not even like this anti-authoritarian turn in Bolsonaro's Brazil. So I'm speaking from the position when over the last 35 years, what we were dealing with were attempts on some authoritarian solutions and limiting of freedom of academia or expression, but it has never since '89 fully materialized. So we were kind of working and acting in under a bit different condition. And now when I think of it, and when I'm trying to relate to what I've heard from my co-panelists, I think that Slovakia and Hungary could serve here as a maybe not better, but as a relevant example and a link, because the authoritarian turn in Hungary has been not only an attempt and not only, which included not only certain political measures, but it was, regardless of the definitions we apply, it was and to some extent still is pure kind of authoritarianism in words and deeds. In Slovak, what we are observing in Slovakia is troubling on one hand, as it should be. On the other hand, what we observe is constant protests. Over the last year, there have been massive protests, probably the largest since like 1989 in Slovakian cities against this authoritarian populist in brackets in inverted commas governments of Robert Fico. So I think like, what happens now in Hungary in this kind of light transitions from authoritarian conservatism to a more moderate conservatism, because we shouldn't have too many illusions regarding the new Hungarian government. I mean, politically speaking and emotionally speaking, Magyar is not Orban, and this is where the positive outcomes really end. And we should really observe what's happening in Slovakia. Slovakian case is also interesting because the government and the political force and political rationale behind it, it's using this populists, and I'm using this concept not as an invective as it is usually used, but as a concept. They are using this populist narrative, like, referring to also playing into social and kind of popular tunes against like austerity measures imposed by foreign countries, foreign players. So like with for what it's worth, like Poland is neither Slovakia nor Hungary. Those of you who follow the news from our part of Europe might recall big without the light, might recall mass protests against abortion ban in 2020. This is one of these kind of most recent examples of popular and in a way anti-authoritarian mobilizations in Poland. A huge movement, to large extent grassroots and not party-oriented, even though some politicians took part of in it, taking place in the middle of COVID lockdown measures. So when I think of it now, like it was quite impressive that in the middle of the pandemic and lockdown and official ban on public gatherings, millions of people, if you count nationwide, took to the streets protesting. What triggered this protest was the very abortion ban, and debating abortion and reproductive rights has been or had been a taboo subject since '89. And something that most political forces and governments were avoiding. So then, like, in the middle of this pandemic crisis, this issue erupted, and it ended up with really mass mobilizations. And that was one of these. Sorry, I can hear some strange. Can you hear? Okay, because, sorry, I need to, because I can hear something in my headphones. Okay,
We can
not
hear you
anymore.
perfectly.
Okay,
I
I
can hear you
will.
perfect, yes.
For a moment, I could hear something in my headphones. Okay. Yeah, so what I mean with this example of mass protests in the middle of COVID and in the middle of this social catastrophe, that was again one of these moments when one could almost be proud to live in this country, and kind of it really gave back the belief in the people and in the society. And another example of this popular mobilization I could think of was in 2022, at the very beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion against Ukraine, which was met by unprecedented mobilization of people from different social strata, different walks of life, who were rushing to the Czech border crossings, railway stations, offering support to Ukrainians fleeing war, offering places to stay in their homes. It was estimated, if I'm not mistaken, that around 100,000 Polish households experienced hosting Ukrainian forced migrant at homes. And that time, I remember from my family living in the UK that TV was showing one family which decided to host Ukrainian refugees, and this one family offering their flat was made it to the national news in the UK. So even though the general level of politicization of Polish society and its tendencies to revolt and to comparing to Latin America or France, Italy, we do not have that much strikes, mass protests, or riots, but from time to time these things happen, and every time they happen, I am very positively surprised that this is something that I wouldn't expect our society to do. So this is just to point out that some of us might be used, especially those of us who either studied in the so-called West, or those who follow the political narratives in the West, might be used to looking for examples to follow from Western Europe, US, and stuff. So what I'm saying is that, in our part of Europe, there are also lots of interesting phenomena that can be observed. And now, slightly narrowing down what I wanted to say regarding anti-authoritarianism. As a scholar of migration, I see some kind of contradictory mechanism to which I already got used to, which reminds me a bit of what Armando said about Hungarian government meeting Cuban delegations. Yeah, that sometimes political narratives do not hold the reality and some possible geopolitical or purely economic gains. So under the conservative right-wing government, we could observe and we experienced openly xenophobic, anti-migrant and anti-refugee narrative, which was used, I mean, kind of all the time. At the same time, the very same government who was using this xenophobic nationalist narrative introduced measures which enabled to migrate to Poland, basically simplified entering Poland and simplified the procedures for undertaking employment, and actually the scale of migration into Poland has increased like historically. Kind of the statistics skyrocketed under the conservative government using anti-migrant rhetoric, which kind of brings us to the issue that kind of the narrative which is used to boost certain sympathies from the right-wing public opinion is one thing. It is very easy to build up your political program basing on this what Assels called primordial understanding of the nation, which we have no time to discuss different ideas of nation and nationhood, but this is really like a very binding thing for political forces in Poland. But it doesn't change the fact that Polish economy, just like Czech or Slovak economy, needs affordable workforce. Let's say it this way, mostly to work in the international investments. This is it can be the fact that some right-wing xenophobic politicians make it easier for the migrants to reach Poland and for the entrepreneurs to employ them reveals some contradiction, but this contradiction plays also a disciplinary role. Yeah, like it makes it quite easy to let these people come, let them work, but still using this narrative to discipline them. And this is where this conservative nationalist agenda means this presumably progressive liberal agenda, which relates democracy and liberalism to common market and, if this word means anything anymore, neoliberal solutions. And this is where I would like to link this, migration studies and studies of xenophobia, nationalism with liberalism, illiberalism, or populism, that, let's say, the progressives or the leftists in Poland and in Central Europe remain in captivity of the struggle of between conservatives and liberals. Yes, so the broad answer to xenophobic anti-migrant sentiments is the argument that Polish economy needs them because kind of we need affordable and disciplined workforce, which is a very short kind of legged argument, because in any kind of economic downturn, economic turbulence, the very same argument starts working against the migrants. And I keep referring to migration and migrant sentiment not only because it's a very important factor in political thinking of political narratives in Poland and in Central and Eastern Europe, but because it also, this narrative affects predominantly Ukrainians, and it also impacts Polish-Ukrainian relations. And if we put a war in Ukraine in the framework of global struggle against anti-authoritarianism, I cannot think of a better example, at least not in our part of the world, than the struggle of let's say liberal, in a broad sense of the term, Ukraine fighting against authoritarian, imperialist, totalitarian Russia. And do I still have like 3 minutes or so, or 5 minutes, or shall I wrap up already?
Maybe we can move on to the Q&A section.
Okay. So I will just put a full stop here. That's what happens in the sphere of migration, anti-migrant attitudes, and Polish-Ukrainian relations can serve as a kind of a litmus test for the global authoritarianism and a kind of right-wing boost Thank you. I could talk forever, but thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Ignacy. So maybe we can have some question of the audience, but before I want to ask Acel, last year I read a book from Diana Kudaibergen. The name of the book is The Kazakh Spring. And for me, it was very interesting to learn how the Kazakh civil society and the academicians organize in the digital activism. Could you please tell us a little bit about other initiative of the civil society and the academicians from Kazakhstan, not only in Kazakhstan, but maybe in the diaspora, how they start to face the dictatorship there?
So we can see several things that are actually happening. A lot of since academia is a very controlled space, and I think I agree with Armando that for post-Soviet regimes, whatever post-Soviet might mean here, I think controlling knowledge production and controlling that critical space is really, really important. So a lot of resistance actually went into arts. And so we have very super critical art scene that unfortunately some of the artists have been kicked off of the Italian Biennale for being too critical for the regime. So it's indeed so the artists have the ability to have that space where they can claim, so to say, the freedom and portray freedom through their work. Yeah, as a kind of a safe, relatively safe space for now. Another thing that people have done is to basically use any public performance, any public opportunities of state violence and turn them into performance. So, for example, when you have somebody who has been picketing on the street, and they have, for example, they can, with a certain statement, the police will come over and will take these people to mandatory 3 hours of prison or interrogation. And then these types of performances then would be surrounded by people who know the protocol now, and they're able to basically then question the rationale, make the police cite the constitution, make the police cite the specific rules that they're violating, and then opening the books and saying, well, that doesn't really say that, and so on and so forth. So in addition, a lot of scholars are now exploring the decolonial frameworks. And I know that in Latin America, decolonialism is usually associated with Walter Mignolo. I think in our case, it's a bit different. I think Walter Mignolo is no longer associated with the classical kind of decolonial scholarship, just because, again, he is kind of blindly accepting the leftist criticism, the Russian criticism of the West as a kind of the only anti-imperial alternative. And now I think there is a very strong kind of desire to really create our own vocabulary of what exactly decolonial Kazakhstan may mean, what type of concepts we can use to basically continue this notion of emancipating ourselves from violence. And violence has been really embodied in many ways. And I think Diana Kudaibergen actually writes about it in her book on Kazakh Spring, that violence is embodied in generations because resistance has been always there. Kazakhstan has faced, just like Ukraine, for example, similar type of Holodomor in the 1930s, and the kind of the nation was brought to the extinction, almost extinction. So in this sense, there is now an opportunity to really for people to think, well, what exactly a non-Soviet vocabulary would mean like? What would be a Kazakh nation or a Kazakh community or any kind of community that lives in Kazakhstan that is not really framed with these ideas of modern barbarian, nomadic versus civilized, and so on and so forth. So what exactly would that mean? And so that's why I think it's a very dynamic space. It may not necessarily be as, I don't want to use the word courageous in fighting the regime. I think it kind of knows the limits and the balance, but it has a lot of different conversations that are taking place through podcasts, through different groups, colloquia of people who are coming in together just to discuss how to actually be, how to be free and free from what. I think these things are taking place.
Thank you, Acel. There in the chat, Armando shared a link to a journal. It's in English. You can send your articles in English. It will be great to have Ignacy, Acel, and all the scholars and students that listened this webinar, because in Latin America, we need to know more about your countries. And in that sense, I have the same question for Armando, a very specific, because we are with limited time. I am very interested, Armando, in how the Cuban academic diaspora, as you, involved in not only in the resistance, but how to show the true faces of the Cuban regime to the world. So that's my question for you.
Yes, it's interesting. Well, Cuba has an experience. I'm not going to share the whole history, but Cuba was in Latin America a country with huge relationship with Europe and USA. And Cuba has in the past, before the revolution, a good level of academy in compare with other Caribbean countries. But yes, without doubt, in the beginning of the revolution, as the Soviet model system, the state invests a lot of money in education. So the academy, for the necessity of the state, grew up a lot, and we have more academy. But the problem is that the contradiction of an state that invests a lot of resource in prepare to the people, but at the same time control the thing that these people can think and express. So when the Berlin Wall fall and the Soviet Union disappeared, a lot of scholars were to emigrate due to economic reasons, but due to the same time to exile, because in Cuba we live a very limited and without state authorization in compared with Soviet Union, a very limited, not experience, but feeling of perestroika. So in the late 80s, a Cuban sociologist, historian, not political science, because we don't have political science recognized by the state, it's interesting, trying to discuss the reality and were repressed. From this moment, Manuel and dear fellows, we have been in the exile, a lot of scholars in Cuba, my case, but other more. And yes, we are trying to create alternative. I'm going to use a concept of the police and checks opposition, intellectual opposition, a parallel police, a parallel police. So we create a organization, conference, but also actions of advocacy inside. That's the reason which I say we don't need and we don't should abandon the existing organization. For example, not only CLACSO, but Latin American Study Association, LASA. LASA was, as you know, Manuel, all the time monopolized the Cuban section by the Cuban government. So if you were to LASA, and LASA is very important, to talk about Cuba, if you were criticized, you were confined, you were in the corner. But in the recent year, a group of scholars, we have decided to be there, to discuss there, and to recovery, no, not recovery, because the first time, to win in the contest to the direction of the section, and we win. We won in the past, in the recent past. So for me, it's the three characteristics. In the exile, try to develop our career in other academies. Second, try to discuss the Cuban reality beyond the polarization of the discourse, especially the discourse of the Cuban regime, and try to have more international presence. For example, this journal that I show you, and you are invited, for example, is a very recent journal that we are preparing, and you are invited to publish here about autocratization, because autocratization is a process in Latin America and in other world, and you are invited. So it's a struggle. We have limited resource because when we arrive, as you know, Manuel, when we arrive to other country, we are not facing the long hand, not only the long hand of the Cuban state that is very long, but also the resistance of the academic community of this country, for example, Mexico or Chile, that are in a big part are close to the Cuban model. So it's a struggle, but we are advancing.
Thank you, Armando. And to all is open the opportunity to publish in autocratization. We will add also the link in the recording. And the last question is for Ignacio. You talk about Ukraine, and maybe the most interesting country to see how the civic society face the situation in Ukraine is Poland, because Poland and Ukraine have a very complex relation, not only in the history, but also in the current situation. Could you explain to us a little bit with a few examples how the civic society in Poland support Ukraine in these difficult times?
This is another question that I could be answering for an hour at least, but let me just put it in some bullet points. Uh, like you correctly said, Poland and Ukraine have, they are connected in many different ways. And what is very important and very often forgotten beyond Poland and Ukraine is that already before the full-scale war, Poland was a destination for over 1 million migrant workers from Ukraine. Like it was 1.5 million in 2021, and I'm not mentioning only because I feel obliged as a migration scholar to speak about migration, but it's the very presence of Ukrainians as people and as figures was very important and in a way central for Poland. It also points to the specifics of Ukraine and its economy to large extent dependent on remittances from labor migrants abroad, which makes Ukrainian example similar to the one of, I don't know, Kazakhstan, Cuba, maybe, I don't know, maybe Venezuela. And there were estimations in 2020 that, and it can be checked on the data published by the World Bank, that the value of financial remittances from migrants was in Ukraine was greater than the value of international investments, which points also to the very specific case, not so specifics for other non-European countries, which also translates into international relations. Very often, even by I referred to the conservative previous governments of Poland. They were using this argument of supporting Ukraine, aiding helping Ukraine at difficult times, and I mean the period before the full-scale war, framing Ukrainian labor migrants as refugees fleeing Ukraine. Let me stress again, that was like 2015-16 when this figure appeared. And the ruling party politicians were referring to, were saying that Poland received over 1 million of refugees, people that no one else in Europe wanted to help. It was counterfactual because these people were not refugees; they were migrants based, working in Poland, basing on work permits and visas. But it was a very strong message which capitalized labor twice. Like, not only were they capitalized as a labor resource, they were also capitalized as a rhetorical figure, and which replaced like labor with like as an alternative to development aid. Yeah? The official message of the ruling party, which was easily picked up by the public opinion, is that Poland is helping Ukraine because, roughly speaking, we allow Ukrainians to work below minimal wage in the most precarious and dangerous spheres of economy. So this is where this figure of Poland helping Ukraine and Ukrainians who should be presumably grateful to Poland for this generous help appeared, and it continued through 2020 and further. Of course, there was, like, apart from all these pathologies, there was a huge upsurge in this kind of grassroots mobility supporting Ukrainians fleeing the war. And there was, and to some extent still is, a kind of movement and lots of grassroots initiatives supporting Ukrainian army, organizing fundraisings, delivering equipment to Ukraine. It is still there. But it doesn't kind of make this sentiments of superiority gone. So apart from this kind of honest, well-intentioned, and in most cases absolutely grassroots initiatives in support of Ukrainian army, displaced people from Ukraine, there still exists, and sometimes they go hand in hand, this narrative of expected gratitude and of Poland kind of, doing, or of Ukraine being unable to function without Poland, which is a trap, and it's a serious problem to be dealt with, especially nowadays when on the official political layer, Polish-Ukrainian relations are quite tensed. Some of you could have heard about this recent fuss with President of Poland taking the Medal of Honor granted to Volodymyr Zelensky, Zelensky sending it back. So, like, basically what happens in the political mainstream in both countries is very problematic. And again, there is this kind of return of the figure of ungrateful Ukrainian Polish helping hand, with what many people do not notice, that very often this helping hand has this kind of aristocratic noble ring, and it's expected to be kissed. But that said, I also urge against any simplifications. There are still lots of well-intentioned initiatives in support of Ukraine, organized by NGOs, by trade unions, by informal social movements, by feminist or LGBTQ plus associations. So this it is still there, and many people are a part of it. But we still need to struggle with this kind of post-colonial imbalances and hierarchies. And since I have a mic now, I would use an opportunity to very quickly mention two subjects. Asel, you mentioned this post-coloniality and decolonization in Central Asia, post-Soviet, whatever context. This is still burning issues in Central and Eastern Europe in general, in Ukraine in particular. And the question you posed, who should be free and from what or from whom, is very on time, because very often, both in Poland and in Ukraine or in Lithuania, this kind of very superficial anti-colonialism is used to address problems with Russia. So basically, anti-imperialism and decoloniality very often just ends on opposing Russia, full stop, without really referring it to power structures, hierarchies, racialization, and so on. So this is something we should keep discussing. And since a lot has been said by Manuel and by Armando about Latin American context, let me point you to the fact that citizens of Colombia have become a very significant group of migrant workers in Poland. There are dozens of thousands of them, and they are among those very active, they form their associations, they join trade unions. A few years back, as a scholar and as a union member, I would have never thought that one of the most active, groups of migrants in labor unions would be the Colombians, and one of those who are actually willing to take to the streets to participate in protests are also Colombians, and recently they are also very well networked with other migrant groups. So I really hope that in a year or two we will have completely different landscape regarding social movements, ethnic diversity, and so on. And for me, it was really unexpected to have this boost of fresh energy and culture of protest from Latin America in Poland. Thanks.
Thank you, Ignacy. So, yes, we did it. A great webinar from Kazakhstan to Cuba to Poland to Chile to Mexico to Kyiv. This kind of initiative like Ruta help us to put together our thoughts, our ideas, and understand that we are in the same boat. And as I said before, I hope this open opportunity to collaborate in specific ways. Armando want to say something, maybe? You raise your hand.
Yes. Well, to remark that thank you for this invitation, because for me it's very special. Mostly the design of the current globalization promote that we are engaged with a network in the global north, specifically in West Europe and USA. But this is experience, and again, with case as Poland, as Kazakhstan, that are very close to Cuba in different issues, especially in the last century, is very important. So all these spaces of GAPAC, of our NGO, the journal, and are open to collaboration. I hope that in the near future we continue this initiative. It's very important. Congratulations to you, congratulations to Ruta, and thank you.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias, amigos. Thank you, my friends. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Again, it was a privilege. Thank you so much.
Bye, Ciel. Bye, Ignacio, Armando.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Nice meeting you.